and welcome to CKI's seventh in our series of podcasts on topics of general interest to do with customs. I am Anthony Buckley, I'm the chair of CKI, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Zandra Horgan from Ireland, who is a customs broker specializing in SPS goods, and also by Mark Rowbotham. Um, a customs consultant and expert from the UK. And our topic for today, suitably enough, is the border target operating model, and in particular, the controls that have been introduced by the UK on their imports and exports since, I suppose, the biggest change was 31st of January last. The border target operating model has been launched in August 2023 after much debate and discussion within the UK about the type of border controls they wanted and the extent of control and how indeed they would transition to full ultimate border controls. It also included many proposals and declarations of intent for improvements in the system. Some of those improvements indeed were discussed in the European Union and in the UK for many years, but the UK is now proposing to use its um, flexibility, now that it's no longer in the European Union, to use that flexibility to accelerate some of those moves, such as the move to a single customs window or a single trade window, as is known in that operation. So this year and the coming years promise to be very interesting. Most of the controls and regulations are due to come into effect this year in 2024. And then many of the benefits and enhancements of the system will commence this year, but are intended to really bear fruit, I suppose, over the next 2 years to 5 years, depending on the topic. The border target operating model is available online to view. It's a rather large document, but it is well worth consulting, especially the timelines, and some of the thinking in there is very interesting. One of the interesting things from an Irish point of view is that the timeline for imports from Ireland and some of the regulations that will apply to imports from Ireland are different from those that apply to continental Europe. And that reflects two things, I suppose. One is the very long-standing open trading position between Ireland and Britain, and it's going to take time to adjust that. And there isn't great anxiety on either side of the Irish Sea to accelerate that tightening of control. And the second element, of course, which is hugely important, is the Windsor Framework, which means that Northern Ireland has a special status between the UK and the European Union. And indeed, many goods flow through Northern Ireland to and from Great Britain and Ireland. So that complicates issues, and it means that a slightly different regime is required. So that's all by way of background. Now, today, there are three questions that seem to us to be particularly uh, interesting to explore. The first is what's been happening since the 31st of January. The second, which we'll move on to, is do these changes primarily concern SPS goods, that is, agriculture, agricultural produce and food and animals, or indeed is the impact of the new controls more widespread and serious than that? And the third question then is I will be drawing on the wisdom of my two colleagues to perhaps identify some key issues that are now arising that importers and exporters trading with the United Kingdom should be particularly aware of. So to begin with, what's been going on since the 31st of January? Could I maybe start with you, Mark, on that one?
Thank you very much, Tony. It's actually rather opportune that we've got the podcast because I actually have a couple of clients who are very much involved with this whole affair, one of which actually produces animal feeds, and that is included in this whole approach. And the other one is dealing with foodstuffs themselves, particularly importing of basic products from the EU. Now, they have been in contact with me for reviews because I originally dealt with them a little while ago. So, of course, it's useful to be able to catch up and find out how they are progressing. Now, the whole issue here, everybody in the UK that was involved with food and drink, even websites such as Food Administrator and various others, were up in arms at the beginning of the year concerning, this new border target operating model, it's going to mean that the shelves clear, we're not going to get any foods in, all the supermarkets are going to be bone dry in that respect. And unfortunately, there was a lot of very adverse publicity, which I must confess did cause alarm and, dare I say, panic buying. Now, the British, I fear, are rather good at that. I slightly distance myself because of my Celtic ancestry and therefore my commitments to both Scotland and Ireland, both of whom have had issues concerning all this. Now, the press has not been fair or just in actually analysing the situation. Since the 31st of January, there has, of course, been the implementation of specific health documentation that I think those present will be aware of, particularly to do with the import of products, animals, food and feed system, IPAFs.
Medium risk products, isn't it?
It is medium risk. And by the way, for your information, for those who are going to watch the podcast, I have produced a page and a half notes which I can send to you both as well concerning the up-to-date situation. And yes, indeed, Tony, it is this whole issue of medium risk, and that it was more sort of knee-jerk reaction, I think, than anything else. Not because the medium risk did or did not exist, but because with precautions and certainly in answer to the EU controls, the UK took the view, Fortress Britain yet again, let's start imposing various checks and balances. Now, the well-known, as you know, Tony, and as you know yourself, Zandra, the number of customs officials manning the frontier has diminished over the past few years, and it is then entirely on either intelligence checks or, for that matter, HMRC's scrutiny of documentation, and for that matter, DEFRA and various other organizations, IFAR, the various of these associations. And again, knee-jerk, let's make sure we're on the right side. But I am glad to say that the so-called adverse publicity from the press and a variety of websites has faded into insignificance, and that the sheer reality is we have as much access to foodstuffs as we used to. One of the companies I've dealt with, based local to home from enough in Lancashire, deals with Westler burgers and things like this. And in all honesty, they have had very little problem with meat products, particularly Irish beef, lamb, anything like that. And in fact, it has made their lives easier. Now, I'll come on to some of the reasons for it in a minute. But the impact has been relatively low, and nobody that I have talked to has actually complained because, we can't get stuff through, whether it is meat, whether it's fish, whether it's dairy products, whether in SPS terms plant-related or fruit-related or vegetables. There has been none of this panic that various people were supposedly inferring. Now,
and has there been any visible impact on price, Mark?
No, that is the other thing. Although the cost of living crisis has happened with all of us, I think partly that has actually cushioned the prices, because in reality, and again, I'll come on to it in terms of the impact, or certainly the stages forward. Pricing has been one where the major supermarkets have been making profits anyway. And I think it's more to do with the small scale business that there may have been a slight adjustment. But it hasn't stopped people buying things, especially when they've been pre-packed or whether they are bottled or canned as anything like that. Now, the agricultural business, of course, relies heavily on a combination of fresh food and also, for that matter, pre-packed food. And in reality, pre-packed means that there have to be proper labels. Well, that should have happened anyway. The whole point of dealing in foodstuffs, and I notice you're nodding your head, Tony, the whole issue is, how on earth do you know what the product is until it's been properly labeled? Then we know what the contents are. We know what the ingredients are. We also know that it's fit for human consumption. There may be a sell-by date on it, but basically that it has been properly described and properly labeled. Now, similarly with fertilizers, the company I deal with has a major headquarters office in Carlisle in Cumbria, but they have a major plant up in Ayrshire in Scotland. Now, they deal with feedstuffs for animals. And again, their concerns have been more to do with the Windsor framework than anything else, particularly to do with the TSS system. And I do sympathize with them because, again, they didn't get a fat lot of help from the UK government departments. Now, I'm not being cynical in any ways, but it doesn't really come as a surprise, because in reality, government departments have not been as vigilant and certainly as aware as at one time they were. And it's been very much up to the trader to find out things for themselves. But then, if you're a large enough trader, you would do that anyway. I think for the larger traders, it has been very little problem at all because they have departments or sections. A company I deal with, known to many as Rouse Honey, based down in Abingdon in Oxfordshire. One of the main directors is Irish. He's based over in Western Ireland, and he was concerned predominantly to do with the impact of this. And in reality, it hasn't affected them much at all. They import honey from elsewhere, Manuka from New Zealand, honey coming in from Africa, Europe, etc. And they were more concerned with processes and making sure that the staff dealing with the administration knew what they were doing. And this is where, in reality, this has worked in their favor. Now, that means the impact has been particularly low. And if you look at it from a risk analysis point of view to do with likelihood against impact, well, the likelihood was based more on conjecture than it was on actual fact. And
this has been a regular complaint, I think, about EU regulations, but
it has, Tony. And I think, well, certainly my view is, if you want to create a storm, you will certainly find one. There's plenty of mountains being made out of molehills up in Iceland at the moment to do with volcanic activity.
And do you think, just quickly, because I'm anxious to move on to Zandra's experience, but do you think any of this may change from the 30th of April mark, when documentary and identity and physical checks are being imposed on EU imports?
That was what I was going to come on to. The second question being, for a start, is it affecting SPS more than it is POAO? The answer is no, I don't think it is, because it all comes under the same category. So if it's dairy products, milk, cheese, etc., that is still subject to normal requirements of bacteria and such like, and the producer should know in any case what they're dealing with. Now, in terms of moving forward, this is to do with planning. And my own version of this, and I've seen it in past experience, is that if you don't plan ahead, you will not get anywhere. But if you do plan ahead and you know what is happening, you can therefore implement procedures to make sure that you will not have problems with either documentation between exporter and importer. The exporters know what the rules are. That's why we have the CHED document, the Common Health Entry documents, and the reference numbers going on import entries. Well, the CDS system for imports has already existed for a year in the UK. unless Zandra wants to correct me. It is working particularly well as long as the information is sent from export to import. That is fine.
Okay.
Therefore, my view on moving ahead is look at what the rules are. Look at what the regulations are. Look at the procedures you need and implement them before the end of April. Low risk is going to disappear anyway. That will not even be looked at. So for foodstuffs that are subject to low risk, they won't even be looked at. They will be pre-cleared and they will come through as normal. Medium risk may still be there, but based on the history, let's say, of trading, where you have exporters and imports who have been involved in this for long enough, I doubt they will have a problem either, partly because HMRC as well as European customs know who they are. They're already registered. There will not be a problem. It may be new importers or exporters who do not have the experience of this that may be subject to more checks, especially since they may not even have the procedures in place.
Indeed.
And again,
so overall, it's as you would see it, it's not really a basis for blind panic. I think I perceive some doubt crossing Zandra's expression. So if you'd like to unmute, Zandra, what's been your story since 31st of January?
Firstly, I just want to say that this is my first podcast. I know I'm a bit late to
welcome
aboard technology world. I know I've moved along. But right, so basically, if you look at what happened on the 31st of January, it's only the implementation of the documentary checks. So there was never going to be delays at the border. There was never going to be a huge impact in the supply chain because all the documentary checks are done in the background. And if you understand what the documentary checks are, it was if your goods are high risk or medium risk, you required your health cert. That health cert, the information that's on the health cert has to match what's on your shed that you prepare in iPass. And if they match, then you've passed your documentary check. For the low risk goods, you're only using an invoice and they're not subject to 100% documentary checks. So anybody who is in the high risk category and the medium risk category may already have had communications from the hub saying that you've had a fail. And I will say that we have had a fail. But the communication is that, on, again, everything that's on your health cert must match what's on your shed. So in this instance, we would have had seal number container number in one section of it, but it needs to be in two different sections, and it wasn't in the second section. Right. So like there's 20 or 30 different boxes. You will have a pass on 28 of them, and you could have a fail on 2. And so you get that communication back so that's what's happening in the background. The only thing that I will say on that is that it is 2 to 3 weeks behind in that you submit your documentation. It can be even longer before you've actually had any communication back that you've had a fail. So you have time then to work with the vets, with the supply chain to make sure, and we put in our own checking systems to make sure that they're going to pass the test before the inspections come into play. Because what happens if you're moving those goods into the EU and you have a documentary check, you have got a delay at port because you need to complete a full identity check on arrival. But DEFRA have the ability to override. They'll see what's the significance of the documentary fail, and they can call you or they don't have to call you. But it will flag up if you continue to have
I'm interested, Zandra, in the 2 to 3 weeks that you mentioned. Does this mean that you must lodge your documentation 2 to 3 weeks in advance of movement?
No. It's still the 24 hours in advance of movement, but the communication back, by the time you get the communications back that you've had a documentary fail. But I'm assuming all that process will actually speed up.
So the goods will have moved.
Oh yeah, the goods will have moved. So it's an advisory to say that you have failed in this instance, and to be aware of it and not to be repetitive, so put your
and in terms of because the rationale behind health checks is that we have had experience. Swine flu, I suppose, is probably the best known experience of where some very nasty viruses indeed got into the EU. And I wonder if health checks are 3 weeks after the goods have been moved in and sold and probably eaten. Is that not missing the point somewhat?
No, but I think that's only the initial phase in that. And I was in Sevington last week, seeing the whole facility. So that's going to be the central hub for doing all these documentary checks. So that's what I'm saying. The process that they have for doing the documentary checks and the staff that they have all in play, that will be much quicker. So you will know, but if you meet that 24-hour deadline of submitting all your documentation, you will know in advance that you will have had your identity check or your physical check when you move your goods after the 30th of April. But yeah, it will, that I'm sure will improve.
Have you any knowledge or any way of knowing, Zandra, whether the same transition, which sounds, as indeed Mark has described as well, it's a fairly soft transition they're going through. Is it as soft for imports from the rest of the world, as it's termed in the BTOM, that is non-EU, non-Irish? Are those goods equally released pending a check, or?
They are, yes. And what I will say on those goods, so we would bring in goods that previously they would have come from rest of the world, entered the EU, and have had an EU validated shed.
Okay.
Right. So what is added now to that supply chain, that EU validated shed is no longer acceptable for the documentary checks. Okay. So while there hasn't been a delay at the ports, there has been a delay in probably getting that procedure put into place in the supply chain to have the vets sign another EU health cert. We need the EU health cert to accompany that consignment. So and
then from 30th of April, okay, so the feeling I get is really that we are in transition, as we know, in the implementation of the border target operating model. And for the moment, at least, we know that there's a softer approach on goods coming from Ireland, somewhat softer. And it seems that the checking is viewed as less urgent, shall we say, on goods coming from the European Union. And that's fine. But then we're moving up to 30th of April, where risk-based identity and physical checks will begin to apply to medium risk products from the rest of the EU, not yet from Ireland. And also they are saying that checks on land bridge transit movements will also commence on the 30th of April. So, are we, could I suggest that maybe we haven't seen any great difficulties because we haven't seen the full system yet? Is that a fair comment?
Not yes and no, because, and I will say on the documentary checks, the Irish goods that are of high risk, they will have had if they've had a documentary fail, they will have had communications as well. So it is across the EU that communication is being rolled out. Now, what I will say, what was said in Sevington is that if they have the discretion, that if they'll see the trucks backed up, if they're, because they won't know until the goods start to come through and they start to get called for an inspection. And also to remember that the inspection rate is only between 1% and 30%. So it's not every truck carrying high-risk goods or medium-risk goods that will be called for inspection. So just to be aware of that. But if Sevington they have the ability to override the system, so as not to have traffic jams and not to curtail the supply chain. So they will be able to pick up when times are not as busy to pull other trucks in for inspection. So they have that bit of flexibility. They are going to manage it. They seem to be very much on top of it and to work with the industry, not to have delays in ports. The only thing I do want to mention here, right, because it's what they have said is for the drivers who are called for inspections, is that if they only have 90 minutes left on their tachograph, or tachograph. Everybody gets my meaning for the drivers. Yes. Is that they take their break first before they go in for inspection. So because they are estimating about 90 minutes for an inspection, and if it goes over, and then the driver has run out of hours and he can't pull out,
of course,
they don't want their
major problems.
That's just
So could I broaden it out a little bit? Because, of course, at the same time as these checks have been commenced, there's a tightening on import and export procedures generally. And the easements that were introduced in January 2021 have now effectively all been removed for non-SPS goods. Is there any word on whether that is causing problems for industrial goods, industrial products, consumer products, that kind of thing?
I'll tell you where there is more emphasis. Firstly, on the fact that declarations may not have been completed properly. As you'll be aware, Tony, the CDS system has created a considerable amount of change, as you'll know yourself, Zandra. It came into force with a great deal of uncertainty at the time, having been delayed already. And I must confess that there are many freight forwarders who even now don't understand it. And I think that created more problems to do with pre-clearance than anything else. Yeah. The other area that has created issues, and although we never talk about it, is still pretty important, and that's excise goods. The quantities of beers, wines, spirits moving through from the continent to Europe has had far more checking done because, of course, the inference of a combination of the excise duty itself, but also the approvals of the various operators and the movement guarantees, which, of course, must be in place. And there have been more cases of trucks being pulled up because the movement guarantee wasn't there rather than anything else. Now, on industrial goods, again, it is largely to do with, as you've said, Zandra, this 1 in 10 check. I mean, the old HMRC rule, and it still applies, is that you really go for 1 in 10 trailers. And unless you have reason to pull up others, let's say that the computer has pulled up a check on a particular company because of past history of non-compliance, which means they would automatically do a Route 1 documentary check and possibly a Route 2 outturn, then things will go through as normal. It's intelligence that has meant that there have been more holdups because of companies with a past history, and therefore they would probably be checked anyway. Similarly, with particular sensitive goods, let's say subject to armaments controls, chemicals, this is, of course, a major area, as we know. And that has created more delays, but it's selective. It doesn't affect conventional imports as such, because as long as the CDS entry was completed in advance and that your ENS EXS system has acknowledged it, then that is not creating a problem.
Okay. Excellent. This was very, very positive, I must say. Frankly, I'm surprised that the transition is moving so smoothly. It's rare that transitions do move that smoothly, but very good to hear.
But I do think, sorry now, Tony, but I do think there's probably a lot of businesses in the EU who haven't moved because they're afraid, they don't know what documentation is required. I think there is a little bit of that maybe going on in the rather than actually trucks being stopped.
Yeah.
So there might be a reduction in trade because they're fearful of sending it across. But yeah, once you know the rules, once you know the documentation, there isn't. It is a new procedure. You do have to prepare for it, but it's a
surprising conclusion to me personally, because of the fact that our statistics in Ireland show that the flow of goods from Great Britain has diminished very markedly since Brexit.
Oh yes, it has.
So I'm surprised if a balancing or a mirror image is not arising in the UK. But if you don't see it or don't see it as yet, then that's.
But it'll be in the
news.
In the stats and in the figures for the trade, which will come out, I suppose, in the next couple of weeks. Will be for February, March. Yeah, that will.
Zandra,
that will tell.
This I can bring you in on as well, because I've had experience already of implementing customs warehouses for 2 companies, because this whole issue of land bridge and transit, dealing with trade between the EU, UK and Ireland. And of course, as you mentioned, Zandra, the whole issue of free circulation, that goods shouldn't enter UK free circulation at all. They should be on T2 transit documents. And I am trying to spread that word more and more, because I'm committed to the trade with Ireland anyway. And I am in the process of telling companies increasingly about the use of transit, T2, and the use of customs warehousing in the UK to avoid this free circulation. But there's one overarching point that I think we need to look at as an organisation, the need for standard operating procedures for both imports and exports. And I am somewhat concerned that most companies I know do not have them in place. My view is, and I think this may be something we consider as an organisation, the facility to create SOPs for imports and exports for companies that are either experiencing problems or generally are involved in this sort of traffic. Because if they have the procedures in place, they will not encounter these problems. They will know what to look for. HMRC certainly requires it, Revenue Ireland requires it, and you will find most of the EU customs authorities equally saying you have to put this in place. The same is true of America and Canada. And a lot of it, as I said before, comes back to planning. If you plan ahead, you will avoid a lot of these issues. It's not just get out of jail free card. It's making sure you've got the whole thing in place and that you know what you are doing.
Okay. So essentially, I must say, neither of you are anticipating any problems. Is that being too positive? I'm sorry, I'm just checking. Maybe Zandra, as we go forward, when you have the 100% physical checks on live animals crossing over from Ireland, for example, is that going to be equally easy?
Yes, no. So, and this is where the whole chain of communication has to exist, because whoever creates your iPass will get notified of the inspection. And then your driver, he can also check the GMR to get notified that he has to go for an inspection. So that whole communication of ensuring that the driver turns up for the inspection and doesn't drive on past where he should be is going to be vital. And just to say, on the live animals, even in Sevington, the live animals are not being introduced on the 30th of April. So all that's been introduced, all that's been introduced for inspections will be the product of animal origin, your animal byproduct, and your high-risk foods of non-animal origin. So that's what's coming into play on the 30th of April. And the live animals still continue to be inspected at place of destination.
Yes.
Until they're expecting that to be operational by October, the end of October. But the communication system then to ensure that because there are stiff penalties for failure to complete your inspection. So that's
so it's very much still a work in progress, as it were. As you say, the border control posts are not physically in place. What about the port infrastructure? There were some questions about an unevenness of development as between ports, and that some ports were not still at the point where Her Majesty or His Majesty's government would like them to be. Is that still an issue, or have the ports stepped up, as it were, and provided the facilities that the system expects?
Not as yet. One of the main, I don't know about you, Zandra, but certainly from what I've been seeing, the UK ports, there's still this issue between inventory and non-inventory linked ports. Now, the ferry companies, the ferry ports, never were really fully conversant with this. And even if you look at developments to do with, let's say, Holyhead, Birkenhead, the likes, there still is a gap concerning the facilities available and equally the knowledge of the port, because after all, this is roll-on, roll-off traffic. For Northern Ireland, it never really was an issue. You look at somewhere like Cairn, Ryan, Troon, traffic even going from Liverpool and Esher. That wasn't really an issue, but then they weren't dealing with the Republic directly. However, concerns were raised, even in HMRC as well as with the government, concerning the ability of the ports to be able to handle this, because many were based purely on groups of officers coming down to ports if need be to look at the paperwork, especially when there was no direct customs control. Now, that still is an issue, and it is being looked at, because the whole question being, should most ports be converted into inventory linked, and therefore should there be customs controls in the actual port environment? But then this was an issue going back to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework back in 2021 when GVMS first came into force. So on that, the jury's out. Whether they will resolve it is a question of resources and whether the need is there, because as you said, Tony, the online portal is designed to take care of most of the customs processes involved, but there is still a need for due diligence.
Yes, I mean the system as it now is in the UK is very much kind of EU light, as it were.
It is,
and it remains to be seen whether that is a sustainable position to maintain, especially with the clear evidence of significant diversion of trade via Northern Ireland.
Indeed.
In both directions. So there is more to be done. And in this morning's news, the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland announced that they propose to attempt to derogate Northern Ireland from the EU regulation dealing with geographical descriptions of goods. So the dust has not yet settled, shall we say, in relation to Windsor Framework disputes.
That's political, Tony, and quite honestly, the DUP has never been in favour of streamlining the system anyway. In reality, the framework as such, although is there, is still creating more issues of uncertainty, because this whole issue of, well, it hasn't all been implemented yet. Certainly in terms of the green lane and the red lane. And somebody has to make a very firm decision. When you're going to implement it, it has to be done. Otherwise, you will end up in complete confusion concerning the paperwork in advance and then the checks on vehicles moving into Northern Ireland from the UK. And likewise, goods at risk of crossing the border. Personally, I don't like the term goods at risk and not at risk. I tend to take more the idea of goods destined for Northern Ireland as a province, and then goods destined for the Republic. So
the word risk is very much coloured by which part of the political spectrum one stands on, I think.
Oh, very much so, very much so.
Anyway, Zandra, and I think, Mark, you've been very helpful in emphasizing the need for planning throughout this entire process. Zandra, could I perhaps ask you, just by way of closing off, what would you advise people to watch for? I mean, do you see dangers, or not dangers exactly, but do you see challenges arising with the further implementation?
Yes, the communication flow. And so from the 30th of April, and you mentioned it already, there won't be any identity or physical checks conducted on movements from ROI to GB. The facilities aren't there, but coming from mainland EU into GB, yes, that communication flow. Also, what needs to be in play, whoever is completing your iPass, you need to have an account in place, because there is going to be fees attracted to all of these inspections, and you need to have what's called a Phyllis account is what it's called, actually opened to pay for all these inspections. So whoever has your iPass and whoever is doing that, you need to be able to pay for these inspections. So you need
there
to
was
have
a suggestion, Zandra, I don't know if you recall, but there was a suggestion in earlier drafts of the Board of Target Operating Model that rather than charging the selected shipments the full fee, that they might charge all shipments a certain flat fee to fund the inspections.
No,
that didn't arise.
No.
Didn't happen.
It is, and so you do need to make sure that you have a mechanism for payment, and to be aware that it's not per truck that comes across that will be inspected. It's actually per sheds that you've created, per iPass. So if you're in groupage and you have 20 items on there that are SPS and could be called for inspections, then you have more tickets in the pot, so you could come out of the pot and be pulled for inspection, rather than if you only have one truck, one iPass. Yeah, so to be aware of that, and the communication. And to make sure.
Do we have any idea at this point what kind of checks on land bridge movements they're proposing?
No, that's going to be updated on the transits. They will update nearer the time on what's going to be the procedures that's required there.
It's exciting times, isn't it? It must be creating some uncertainty, Mark, for UK importers as well. I mean, manufacturing industry, in terms of not really knowing for sure what additional costs are going to be involved, and the potential for delays.
Indeed. I mean, the costs are going to be there, but you see, again, if it's per trailer, the costs, of course, can be apportioned out. Bear in mind what you said, Zandra, about groupage loads. The risk is that about out of your 20 consignments, 15 might get through okay without the need for a check, but then 5 are going to have to be looked at. Well, that could well delay a trailer, unless the driver said, I'm just going to leave the 5 here and I'm going to go off with the other 15. I think that is an area which will need to be looked at, because let's say in the investigation of 5 consignments will delay the whole trailer. Now, on, let's say, land bridge, as long as there is a seal on either the trailer or the container, then that makes the whole consignment, the whole movement integrated anyway. And therefore, there should be, in theory, no need to check anything inside, because if it's moving from, let's say, the Netherlands through via the Humber, across the M62 to Liverpool, and then across on the ferry to Dunlara, Dublin, whatever, then in theory, since it hasn't touched UK free circulation, there should be no need to examine anything. It is more to do with the usual customs technique of recording the seal number, the trailer or container manifest, and then, of course, the T2 documents associated with it. Now, that we're still obviously looking at. I think, in fact, this is one of the projects we need to look at seriously, because otherwise it will hamper a lot of movement and will create additional cost. But again, the overarching issue is the lack of awareness on the part of the import trade. You find we've been talking about this for long enough, but it still comes down to awareness and knowledge of the system. You cannot expect it to be right if you don't understand it. If you know what you're talking about and you have a professional knowledge, then of course you will find it is plain sailing, and in fact you're relied on to get it right. Now the larger companies do have this, but it's the SMEs, and I think this is where we have to look at seriously. The SMEs do not have the expertise on board, and I have to say that even with what I've said earlier, the main problem arises with companies that are not aware of these challenges, and certainly the procedures and regulations that may suffer. But again, it still comes down to awareness, planning ahead, and knowledge through whatever means.
So I suppose what all three of us can certainly agree on is that the one thing that companies should not do is ignore the process.
Correct.
You really have to engage with it.
Yes.
And of course, Zandra and Mark, we would also advise all companies to retain the services of professional and thoroughly competent brokers and consultants to help them in this.
Indeed.
Okay. So I think we will close the podcast there for today. Thank you both very much. It's been a really interesting and illuminating insight